Most people stop eating when the food is gone or when they feel uncomfortably full. Japan stops earlier, and the reasons go much deeper than willpower or discipline. Eating to 80% keeps metabolism, digestion, and energy levels in a state that eating to 100% consistently disrupts. And Japan has the population data to prove it works, in the form of one of the longest average lifespans recorded anywhere on the planet. These aren't diet tricks or wellness trends. They're deeply embedded cultural reasons that explain why Japan has one of the leanest, longest-lived populations on the planet. Today, we're counting down 12 reasons the Japanese stop eating before they're full. Watch until the end, because number 12 is the one reason behind all the others, and it's not something most people in the West ever think about. Number 1, taught to stop at 80%. Most eating habits are absorbed passively. You eat what's served, you finish what's on the plate, and the idea that there's a specific point before fullness where you should stop is never introduced as a concept worth learning. Japan introduces it in childhood. Hara hachi is a Confucian teaching adopted into Japanese culture, particularly in Okinawa, that translates as eat until you are 8 parts full. Japanese children grow up hearing it at mealtimes the same way Western children grow up being told to finish everything on their plate. Except the Japanese instruction produces the opposite outcome. By the time a Japanese person is an adult, stopping at 80% isn't a rule they consciously apply. It's simply what the end of a meal feels like. The habit is installed early enough that it stops requiring any effort to maintain. That's the difference between a diet and a cultural norm. One requires willpower every time. The other requires nothing at all. Number 2. Chopsticks slow them down. Eating speed is one of the most underestimated factors in how much food a person consumes before stopping. The faster food enters the stomach, the less time the brain has to register what's arriving. And the further past the point of actual satiation most people travel before the signal finally catches up. The fullness signal takes approximately 20 minutes to travel from the stomach to the brain. Eating a meal in 10 minutes means the signal arrives after the plate is already empty. Eating the same meal over 25 minutes means the signal arrives while food is still being consumed, creating the opportunity to stop. Chopsticks naturally produce the slower option. They pick up smaller portions per bite than a fork or spoon, require more deliberate handling, and create a pace of eating that gives the brain the time it needs to catch up with the stomach. Japan doesn't slow down to eat more mindfully. The tool they eat with does it automatically. Number 3, they never eat distracted. Distracted eating disconnects the brain from the physical experience of consuming food. When attention is on a screen, a conversation, or anything other than the meal itself, the sensory feedback that contributes to the feeling of satisfaction, the taste, the texture, the smell, the visual presentation, is processed partially rather than fully. The result is a meal that doesn't satisfy in the way it should, which is one of the primary reasons distracted eaters consistently consume more than they intended and still feel less satisfied than someone who ate the same food with full attention. Japan treats eating as a dedicated activity. The meal receives attention. Itadakimasu, the ritual phrase said before eating, marks the beginning of the meal as a deliberate act. Phones stay down. The food is tasted rather than consumed. When the brain is fully present during a meal, it registers satisfaction more accurately and more promptly. Stopping before full becomes easier because the signals that indicate it's time to stop are actually being received. If you're enjoying this so far, go ahead and tap like. It tells YouTube you want more of Japan's clever everyday innovations. And if you love discovering things you didn't even know existed, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this list. Trust me, the next ones are even more interesting. Number 4. Miso soup comes first. Starting a meal with liquid before solid food arrives is one of the most effective and least discussed appetite management strategies in any cuisine. Warm liquid taken before eating raises the body's core temperature slightly, stimulates digestive enzyme production, and partially fills the stomach before a single solid calorie is consumed. Japan starts every meal with miso soup, and the sequence is deliberate. By the time the rice, fish, and side dishes are eaten, the stomach already has several hundred milliliters of warm broth in it. The total volume required to reach the point where stopping feels natural is significantly less than it would be if the meal started with solid food and the stomach began completely empty. The miso soup itself is nutritionally valuable, providing probiotics, sodium, and warmth. But its position at the beginning of the meal rather than alongside it produces a satiety effect that changes how much solid food is needed before the meal feels complete. Number 5. Their food is low in calories. The stomach has a physical capacity. It holds a certain volume of food before the stretch receptors in its walls send signals to the brain indicating that enough has arrived. Those signals are triggered by volume, not by calories. which means the caloric density of the food determines how many calories are consumed by the time the stomach reaches that point. A stomach filled with white rice, miso soup, grilled fish, tofu, and pickled vegetables reaches its volume threshold at a fraction of the calories that the same volume of Western food would contain. Japan's traditional diet is built almost entirely around low caloric density ingredients. The meals are filling in the physical sense because the stomach reaches capacity, but the caloric load at that point is significantly lower than an equivalent volume of processed food, fried food, or high-fat Western alternatives would produce. Stopping before full is easier when the food filling the stomach is doing so efficiently. Japan's diet makes overeating in caloric terms structurally difficult before it ever becomes a matter of self-control. Number 6. Meals served in small portions. A large plate of food creates a psychological and physical invitation to keep eating until it's gone. The portion defines the expectation, and finishing everything on the plate is so deeply normalized in most Western cultures that leaving food behind requires a conscious decision rather than simply stopping when satisfied. Japan removes that dynamic by serving meals across multiple small dishes. Each bowl and plate contains a single component in a modest portion: rice in one bowl, soup in another, a small piece of protein on a separate plate, a few pieces of pickled vegetable in a tiny dish. Nothing comes in a quantity that could be considered generous by Western standards. The total food across all dishes is sufficient, but because no single vessel contains enough to constitute a full meal on its own, the act of finishing each dish doesn't trigger the same compulsion to continue that emptying a large Western plate does. The meal ends not when a plate is clean, but when all the small dishes are done, which happens naturally at a point significantly closer to 80% full than 100%. Number 7. Fermented foods regulate fullness. The gut and the brain communicate continuously through what researchers call the gut-brain axis, a bidirectional signaling network that influences hunger, satiety, mood, and metabolic function. The composition of the gut microbiome, the community of bacteria living in the digestive system, directly affects the quality and accuracy of those signals. A gut microbiome populated with diverse, healthy bacterial cultures produces satiety hormones more efficiently and more accurately than one that isn't. The signals that tell the brain a meal is sufficient arrive more promptly, more clearly, and at the right time rather than delayed or muted. Japan consumes fermented foods at almost every meal: miso in the soup, natto at breakfast, tsukemono alongside the rice. Each one contributes live bacterial cultures that support the microbiome continuously rather than through occasional supplementation. The practical result is a digestive system that communicates fullness signals more accurately. Stopping before full is easier when the body's internal signaling is functioning the way it's supposed to rather than being undermined by a gut environment that can't produce those signals reliably. Number 8. Smaller restaurant portions. Walking into a restaurant in most Western countries involves navigating a menu where portion sizes are a selling point. Larger is better. Value is measured in volume, and the expectation of leaving the table completely full, often uncomfortably so, is built into the pricing, the plating, and the cultural norm of what a restaurant meal is supposed to deliver. Japan's restaurant culture operates from a completely different premise. Portions in Japanese restaurants are sized around what a person needs rather than what impresses them. A tonkatsu set meal, a ramen bowl, a teishoku lunch set all come in quantities that satisfy without excess. The expectation of leaving the table comfortably nourished rather than stuffed is built into the format of the meal. When restaurant portions are sized correctly, stopping before full doesn't require any resistance to what's on the plate. The plate simply doesn't contain enough to push past that point, which means the environment itself does the work that willpower would otherwise need to do. Number 9. Green tea instead of sugary drinks. Liquid calories are one of the most significant and least acknowledged contributors to overconsumption in Western diets. A large soft drink, a glass of juice, a sweetened coffee, all of these add hundreds of calories to a meal without triggering the same satiety response that the equivalent calories from solid food would produce. The brain doesn't register liquid calories with the same efficiency it registers solid ones, which means drinking caloric beverages during a meal adds to the total consumption without meaningfully contributing to the feeling of fullness that would indicate it's time to stop. Japan drinks green tea with meals. It contains no calories, no sugar, and no additives. It provides hydration and warmth that contribute to the physical sensation of fullness without adding anything to the caloric total of the meal. Replacing a single large soft drink with green tea at every meal removes hundreds of calories from the daily total, without changing the food consumed, without reducing satisfaction, and without requiring any conscious effort beyond the choice of what to drink. Number 10. No dessert course. A meal that ends with a dedicated dessert course doesn't end when the body has had enough. It ends when the dessert is finished, which is typically well past the point where stopping would have been appropriate. Dessert is consumed after a complete meal because it's sweet, not because the body has any remaining nutritional need for it. The sugar stimulates appetite independently of hunger. The social norm of finishing the course creates pressure to continue eating, and the result is a consistent pattern of consuming significantly more than a meal without dessert would have produced. Japan ends meals with green tea and occasionally a small piece of fruit. Neither triggers the independent appetite stimulation that sugar produces. Neither extends the meal past the natural point at which the body has received what it needs. The absence of a dessert course isn't deprivation in Japanese food culture. It's simply where the meal ends, at the point where the savory food is finished, rather than at the point where an additional sweet course has also been completed. Number 11. Overeating is socially unacceptable. Behavior that attracts social disapproval becomes self-regulating in ways that conscious personal discipline never quite achieves. When something is considered embarrassing, inconsiderate, or a mark of poor self-control in the eyes of others, most people modify their behavior to avoid it without any external enforcement being required. In Japan, eating to obvious excess carries social weight. Visibly overeating, ordering more than you can finish, or drawing attention to the quantity of food consumed is considered a form of self-indulgence that reflects poorly on the person doing it. The cultural value placed on restraint, consideration, and self-control extends to the dinner table as naturally as it extends to any other public behavior. This doesn't mean Japanese people are anxious about food or eating. It means the social environment around mealtimes reinforces moderate consumption in the same passive way that any cultural norm shapes behavior. You don't need willpower to avoid something when avoiding it is simply what people around you do as a matter of course. Number 12. They've seen it add years to life. Every other reason on this list is a mechanism, a tool, a habit, a cultural norm, a food choice. Each one makes stopping before full easier in a specific and practical way. But underneath all of them is something that no mechanism can replicate on its own. Japan has watched moderate eating work across generations. Okinawa, the region where Hara hachi is most deeply practiced, has historically produced one of the highest concentrations of centenarians anywhere in the world. Japanese people don't follow these eating habits because a nutritionist recommended them, or because a wellness trend made them popular. They follow them because their grandparents did, and their grandparents lived into their 90s eating exactly this way. The most powerful motivator for any behavior is visible, lived evidence that it works. Japan has that evidence in the form of the people sitting across the table at family dinners. Still sharp, still active, still present, decades longer than most of the world manages. That's not a diet. That's a reason. If you want to see more amazing things Japan is doing better than the rest of the world, then like and subscribe. And make sure to watch the video on your end screen. It's packed with even more life-improving things.